didn't have this memorized. 1901, Reverend Van Dusen was the presiding elder at Boise. In 1905, he was instrumental in bringing the church to Rupert and Twin Falls and Burley. This is the first Episcopal Methodist church. It was built in 1878 in Cassia County in Albion, Idaho. That building still stands and has had many uses. Reverend Van Dusen appointed W.C. Mitchell to that church in 1905, who later then came to Hayburn Church and then to Burley. In 1864, now just Idaho became a territory, and then there was Alturas County, Logan County, Lincoln County, and then Minidoka County was cut out of that. And Henry Shoddy and his wife came to this area on the north side of the river in 1883. In the 1870s, Raft River and many was homesteaded and rancher Andrew Sweetser. Many of you going to Utah have seen Sweetser's Pass. And there's a Yale exit. Well, he sent his son to Yale University, and in 1885, he came back with two brothers, George and Harry Burroughs, and they established what they called the Bar-Y Ranch. The two brothers, the Burroughs' younger brother, Edgar Rice Burroughs, arrived at Yale in 1891, and he was only 15. In 1897, Sweetser Burroughs Mining Company was formed, and gold dredging began on the Snake River by Raft River, working its way this way. The young Burroughs, Edgar Rice Burroughs, wrote his first book, Tarzan of the Apes, and was published in 1912. And he also worked at his brother's store in Minidoka and also worked in Mercantile store in Pocatello. There's the Sweetser Burroughs tugboat and gold dredge on the Snake River in 1897, and many of you have seen the river with those islands out there. A lot of those are dredging piles from the gold. This is what Minidoka looked like, and the Sears Hotel is on the right, which was established in 1894 by Hardy Sears, who came from Albion. This is the beginning of building of Minidoka Dam. It was November of 1904. So we're working up to the Methodists getting here, but there was a lot of stuff happening prior to 1905. Now there's the Rupert Mercantile, which sets kind of where the old pancake house was over near the depot, and it was named after the railroad mail carrier, Mr. Rupert, and his name was put on the mail bag and it was left there. So that's how Rupert assumed its name. And then where Mad River is now, but many of you know on the south building on the east side of the square, which was known as Craven Transfer, was the Reclamation Building in 1905. And it was also the place for the first parties that were held, first dances. This is the west side of the square, and the drug store there is where U.S. Bank stands today on the west side. So this is how the town looked when Reverend Van Dusen came and Reverend Lambert. Now this is in the center of the park, as we know it today, and it was first called Well First because that's where the reclamation dug the well. And then it basically held water there until 1912 when the water tower was built. This is Reverend Van Dusen. He was presiding elder of the Idaho Conference. And in the first issues of the Rupert Pioneer, which was September 14th, 1905, and there were two papers, and the Rupert Record, which came out on September 21st, 1905. And they both talk about Reverend Van Dusen being here and is going to organize a Methodist Episcopal Society. And he did. This is where Workman Brothers Cadillac Pontiac dealership is on the south side of the square. And this is where the first trustees are organized, and that's where Madam Norwood, and I'm sure that Mrs. DeMary remember that spot. This is young Mr. DeMary, college educated, came out and was a reclamation engineer, and that's his wife and daughter Dorothy, who was born in 1901, and that's their homestead house. Actually, it's their house here in town until they built a home later, but they also had a homestead farm which they later sold to John Remsburg east of town, and that's the original DeMary place. And Mr. DeMary was elected president of the first trustees, and he was treasurer of this church for 25 years. This is Frank and Ida Sullivan, and they homesteaded out near Pioneer School on 100 North, out by Fredericks, between 3 and 400. And they used to go through the fields, and she was one of the first teachers at the old wooden Pioneer School. And later on in the 20s, she became school superintendent. Here's Reverend Lambert arrives, and he says that he arrived in Rupert on September 20th, 1905. And he preached his first sermon in the Rupert Dance Hall, which was behind the old Caledonian Hotel, and I'll show you a picture of it here in a second. But it's on 5th, between F and G. And these two young kids are Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Hogue. He was an engineer for the reclamation, and they are also original trustee members. This is the first sermon was in a carpenter shop in Hayburn. Now, I really had lots of stuff to look over through all of this, but he specifically says this. And later services were in Mrs. Jones' dining hall, which one of those I don't know, then rented the Petersons' dance hall. And that was reported on September 24th, 1905. So that's 4 days after he's arrived here. They got right off the bat, got busy and built him a parsonage. And it was right here on this property, just to the north of us here. And it had its first poplar tree, and I'm not sure which pastor, if it's Hardin or if it's Aldrich, says that tree was the first tree planted in Rupert. Then, of course, they cut it down. But anyway, this house is on H Street between 10th and 11th. It's a long little house, kind of had a little chalet roof to the front door, but that was where that building went. So it's still inside there. Now this is the dance hall, and this is all where the first sermon was given by Pastor Lambert, but it's also where the first school was organized, and it's also where Mr. Catmull was the choir director. And so at that point in time, regardless of denomination, everyone joined in and had church services and Sunday school classes for their children. So it gives you a great idea as to the type of people that were here. This is an example of a lot of the homes, the first homes, the homestead places. A lot of them one was a shack, another was quite substantial, and all waiting for water. But this is how they looked originally. And then this is the first church built in Rupert, and it's where Simpson's dental shop is now on 8th Street. And if you notice in the background, that steeple is the first Catholic church, and that was built in 1907, and it was taken out in 1957 to Alfred Ulrich's place on the Asequa Highway, and it became a beehive house. It's still there. This is our very first church as it looked in 1907 at Easter and Thanksgiving. So it's kind of, notice the sagebrush is beating around and there's nothing in the background. It's pretty lonely and desolate, and can you imagine the wind blowing? Then in 1907, this is a later picture, but this church was built, and it's 1907 because it's later because it has the belfry and the bell didn't come until 1909. And Reverend Aldrich, he was it's at that time that the Hayburn Methodist Episcopal Church is linked with Burley. And they also added a small room onto the parsonage, and the bell tower was added while he was here between 1907 and 1909. And there's the bell. It was a steel alloy bell weighing 600 pounds, and it was also used by the city of Rupert to report fires or other emergencies before it was put up in the belfry. Here's Frank Hardin and Reverend Martin. Frank Hardin, in the book, if you happen to get it, wrote a very glowing story back to his friends and church family in Chicago about what he found out here when he came, and very much gave a glowing report like Reverend Lambert did. Reverend Lambert said he expected to find a bunch of hicks and people that have low morals and whatever, but what he found was there was an educated group of people who were Christians and cared very deeply, and some were educated, but those who were not educated formally had good common sense and were upstanding citizens, and that's how Rupert got a good start. And Reverend Hardin tells a great story about that also. Now here's the brick company in Heyburn, and it produced a yellow brick, so whenever you see a yellow brick buildings around here, that all came from Heyburn, and then there was also red brick. And then this is the Lincoln School that was first school built in Rupert in 1909, and it was of yellow brick, and it's the only sign that ever happened. It's called Lincoln Park today over on 8th Street. And then here is the Rupert High School, which was completed in 1914, and notice that there's a horse-drawn school wagon in front. And that's how it looked in 1914. And you also notice in the background that the water tower has been built, 1912, 1913. So a great bunch of stuff was happening at this time. And then here the two schools are together. And then in 1911, the people in Rupert decided that they didn't want anyone to divide the park into squares so that it could have extra parking and this and that, and they voted to keep this a personal park forever, and aren't we thankful that they did, because we have a really unique place instead of turning it into a money-making business. Anyway, this particular picture is the very first lighting after World War II, when the whole town was dark during the war, but this is the Christmas lighting period, and the camels in there, they were green and red in color, so it was quite nice. I still remember that. And here's the water tower when it also now had a light on top of it, a beacon and a siren. And then here's Dr. John Carnegie and his family in front of their home on 523 J Street, just down the street here, early on. And then in the center front is young Fair Carnegie. After he graduated, he went to college and came back and became a doctor with his father. Mr. Goodman is also in there, a grandfather of Bill Goodman. Here is the laying of the, or setting of the cornerstone for the new church, 1913, 1914. Now you notice that the old church has been moved to the right, upper right there, and it probably is sitting really close to where the law office is next door, and in the background you can see the roof line of Mr. DeMary's home. You can see the roof line of it there. And this is the remnants of our time capsule. That was the box, and then there's a newspaper, and then there's plans for the church and a few other little remnants of maps and this and that. But that's kind of how it looked at the time. But that's how it looks now. So, but anyway, at least we have a picture of it. Reverend Baker was here between 1912 and 15 when the second church was built, and April 2nd, 1913, the board approved the plans for a new church building. The first Boy Scout troop was organized, and this church was completed in February 14th. Church was completed and dedicated February 14th, 1915, exactly 100 years ago today. And that's how it looked. Got the new trees in the back. You see the old church is still on the right-hand side, hasn't been moved out. And then the little house on the left, Mr. DeMary's mother and father lived in that for many years. She passed away in 1935. And Mr. DeMary was a member of the Civil War, and he passed away in 1911 and is buried in the military cemetery in Boise. But notice how tiny those trees are out front? And there the trees and the bushes have kind of grown up, and I think we've even got a paved street. But it was a very imposing, very beautiful building. Now, and many of those of you who do not remember Mrs. Ruby Gilmore, she's on the far right without the hat. She was who was an English teacher for me, but I don't ever remember a time not knowing her. But she was a member of the Jenny Wren Club, and that group put together, and they bought this window for the new church. It's Jesus knocking at the door. And this is the inside of the old church, and it's looking west, and the organ is back in behind those curtains, and it's the same organ in this picture that Judy played on today. And the door to the left was back into the pastor's room, and the other door went down into a classroom and into a Sunday school rooms. And if you'll notice, the piano is on the far wall to the right. This is how the sanctuary looked inside. And this is looking back, looking to the east, the big tall windows. And that's looking to the north, and up on that second floor were curtains, and if there was overflow, classrooms are up there, but if there was overflow, those curtains would be pulled back and chairs would be set, and people would be able to accompany them there. The doors at the bottom, they look kind of wrinkly, but they're sliding doors, and you could open those up and accommodate more people into the sanctuary. So it was partitioned off. But one thing that was always common from the very beginning was jackrabbits. And every one of these people that came to this country, it didn't matter if you lived in town, you still had to fence something, because jackrabbits would eat your trees, they'd eat the bark, they'd eat your haystacks, they'd eat the winter wheat, they'd eat the spring wheat, and they'd eat the summer wheat. So it was pretty tough times here for many, many years, and they were not completely destroyed up until the 1950s. This is on the Ellis homestead in Paul, and this was the first school in Paul. Now Paul, the railroad wasn't completed until 1910, going between Rupert and Eden and Jerome and on to Bliss. But this school still stands there, and this is how it looks today. And the Methodists who lived over there sometimes met there for their services. They also met in their homes, and they also went to what's known as the old Lincoln School out on 700 West, and then a pioneer school. So they went wherever they could find a place and have a place to teach. And then we have 1915 to 1917, and then 1917 to 1923. And Ebenezer Deal and Reverend Barnes were also helping to preach not only here, but to members over in Paul. And that picture of this Paul church is where the church is now, but it was being turned and added and faced on and added on to so that it looks like it does today. So the Paul people were always very much included and were not left out by these preachers, even though it wasn't always very convenient. This is, if you see the church in the background looking this way, the DeMarys on their DeMary lawn, the Ladies' Aid, they were all getting together and providing and thinking up something to a cause. Reverend Heath, he was also served the churches in both Rupert and Paul between 1923 and 1927. And in 1924, there was a renewal of the charter for Boy Scouts, and it was signed by Mr. DeMary, A.F. Beamer, and I didn't take that A out of there, did I? Calderhead and Fair Carnegie, Fair H. This is the young Carnegie. Then we were served then by Reverend Meredith and Reverend Phillips. Both pastors served Rupert and the Paul Church on up from 1927 to 1934, so they were involved both ways, and this has all been documented. Now, Dr. John Carnegie passes away after 28 years of service. That was in 1934, and in 1937, our Kimball 2-manual pipe organ was purchased in 1937, installed in 38, and you heard it to play today. And over behind you to your back left, behind that enclosure, are the pipes, where that hand went up. Then in 1939, the church has now been renamed as the Methodist Church. It's no longer Episcopal. Reverend Parrott here arranged for the 90-voice Japanese choir from the Hunt camp to visit and perform at various churches. And he's also the one who baptized me. Getting ready for Reverend Ray. Reverend McNeil was also on these trips that took these Japanese kids who were invited to go to church camp. These pictures came from Mary and, tell me, Cheryl. No, the other sister, the McCall sister. Anna Mae, thank you. Anna Mae and Mary McCall sent me these pictures. And so there's proof. You see the Hunt camp in that back picture, and these kids were getting to go to camp. Our next pastor was Reverend James Crow, and he also had, he was called into the Korean service shortly after he came here. And that's him. He brought those two Van Avery brothers, Ernie and Glenn Van Avery, together with a meeting in Korea. So he pulled a little power play there and got those two boys together. And they also happen to be brother-in-laws of Frank McCall and Cheryl. And here's the 1949 excavation for the new educational building. And you see them, there's Floyd Eilers in there and a few other, I don't have their names there, but you see they're building around the old church. And then Reverend Crow was also instrumental in 1952 in establishing the youth ranch. Now, the very first boy arrived in 1957, about the time that this picture is taken, as to how it looked then. And he was a man, he was a Methodist minister who had a vision, and he followed it all the way through. Now, during Reverend Terry's time in 1951 to 53, when the education building is completed, church services were still held in the old church. He began the church library, and then the Northsider children soon filled all the classes. New fellowship hall was used by the classes of 1930, the Rupert High School class of 1932 for their 20-year class reunion. Now, the first drawing was August 4th of 1953 for the homesteaders on the north side. Reverend Coe came in 1953 and was here until 1960. And Reverend Kriego, they both shared Paul and Rupert churches until Reverend Kriego took charge of the Paul Church in 1956. Tom Pierce became choir director and was that for 19 years before Stan Bruns took over. And we still have Stan. Where are you, Stan? There he is. Okay, we still got him. And in 1955, we had our Golden Jubilee 50-year celebration. Now here's Reverend Kriego and Gerald Snyder, and by the way, Leola Bailey is here today, and that's her father. As they're accepting award, the Reverend Albert B. Parrott Award, given for evangelism, and it was won by the Paul Church at the Idaho Conference of the Methodist Church in 1957 because they had more new members than any other church in the conference. And they had gained 39 new members that year. And here's the sanctuary that we are seated in today as the frame is up and it's being constructed. And if you notice the building in the back, you see that windows there would be where the stairway is up to the radio room. And then if you'll notice in this picture, you see the pretty colored windows up there, and many of you may have wondered why those windows don't all shine with light. Well, they did when the church was built because that hallway back there was not covered over. So because of the draft and leaves and the whole idea was the two buildings had to be put together. So the roof line of the other building came in and closed these windows, as you see up here to your top left in the building. So until someone comes along, some dowager or some rich businessman comes and will put lights behind those windows. Oh, guess what? Isla Jane Aycock gave in to Ellis Lloyd. And there they are. And he's still giving in, right, Isla Jane? Guess what? Here's Reverend Ray. That's how he looked when I first met him. So interesting, because of the large influx of new members, church services were held 2 times on Sunday. Easter Sunday, they had 3 services. There were so many people here. Reverend Thompson also married Sharon Knobloch and John Crow in 1960. And Barbara Leinert and Neil Nyblad were the first to be married in this new sanctuary on Christmas Eve of 1961. Is Reverend Thomas and married Leanna and Stan Bruns. That's Stan on the right. And Reverend McConnell and Everett Gardner came between 1967 and 1971 at the height of the ending of the Vietnam War, Watergate, Spiro Agnew, the vice president, stepping down, Martin Luther King being killed, and the whole mess. So that was a real tough time. And all the kids leaving town and going to San Francisco. Reverend Gaither was here between 71 and 1974, and they were the first occupants to live in the new parsonage in 1972. Reverend Gaither also rang the bell when the Vietnam War ended in 1973. And this is the site of the new Methodist parsonage where Pam lives today, and groundbreaking for that was September 17th, 1972. Reverend Shea was here. We honored Bob Sequest on a day for October 26, 1975. And members went to help in the cleanup work following the Teton Dam collapse. Stan and Leanna Bruns and Jay Eilers created a program for our nation's bicentennial celebration, and a potluck was held also. Reverend Dickerson added 66 new members in 3 years. He was vice president of the Ministerial Association and the Kiwanis Club, and he was instrumental in getting a nursery being built with cribs and a playroom. That's between 1977 and 1980. Reverend Ralph Wild, he had a cover put on the parsonage for the patio. The sprinkler system for lawn with an own which had its own pump was installed. And the intergenerational park right to the left of us here, right next door, was created on the west side. Electric heat replaced the coal system. New fans in the sanctuary were installed. Choir shell was built by Wayne Wilski and Walter Stark. Now over there in the corner where the choir sits, it used to be up a little higher than that, but there was also a shell roof over for acoustics was there. And so all we have now is Wayne. Where are you, Wayne? I didn't mean to sound like it wasn't anything, because it was a big deal.
Hey, Wayne, one of your bolts is still in the wall. I want to get that out.
Clifford said there's a bolt left up there in the ceiling. Can you get it down? And Ralph created a history of the church. Reverend Smith, he graduated from Rupert High School, was out and about and back and forth, and the notable things I could find about him was he was real happy to be back here, but he had an airplane, he collected rocks, and was an avid reader of Scientific American. He was also instrumental in creating the Capital Improvement Fund, and that was between 1984 and 1986. Reverend Lineberry, he made a special effort to call on all people by creating an extensive, systematic program of pastoral visits to all members of the churches, and if he missed one, he got you twice. Guess who? Wedding of Terry. Terry is looking like she says whoopee, and Brian looks that same way. Yeah, let's get out of here. And Colton wasn't even here yet. Reverend Keith Weiss came in 1994, and I think that he came at the same time that my mother died, and it was also the same week that Jenny Newcomb lost her daughter Christy. And so it was pretty tragic. I'd never known him before, and I came up from California, and here this guy pulls into the yard, and had no idea who he was. But he came in the morning, and he came in the afternoon, and came every day all week long, was just there, and will always be very grateful for the time he gave us. And then, of course, he marries Jean, and many of you know Pastor Keith, but he came here as a single man. Now, in 2002, Cliff Hebe and John Johnson created a radio station for this church, and it developed into what it is today. So we're going on to, 12 years? 13, something like that now. Reverend Jerry Steele, he was a great speaker for the church centennial in 2005. And then the Rupert Centennial in 2006, he was a guest speaker in the city park and gave a very good talk blessing the water for this area. And he was here until 2008. And while at the same time this plan was drawn up for the sanctuary as you see it today, and we had the open house here on August 17th of 2008. Guess who? Pam came to Rupert in 2008 and began at Paul United Methodist Church in 2011, and she served both churches. And I had to use my own embellishment here. A true rugged individualist, Reverend Pam was blessed with the ability to tell a great Bible story sermon, and I believe that to be true. And some of the things that we've done is young Methodists receiving scholarships here are Sarah Thompson Fowler, Colton Bruns, Caleb Gilbranson, and Rob Newman on the far right. And then here, Cliff Hebe's. I couldn't, what else to say other than it's one of a kind, had to quote it, invention using his creative talent, and what else can you say? And there it is. You still have it? Still hasn't, still works. So maybe it's for rent. Do you think? Now, Brian Williams, are you here? Oh, this is a good one for him not to be here. They're trying to think about church or something, but you see that look on his face? He's trying not to think. So, it's called Think Church. And he was. Now, Leanna Bruns is retiring with great affection from Stan and the entire congregation, and that's at the party that was given for her when she retired from the office. But she hasn't really retired because she's still around. You can't, everyone see her one spot and then the next minute she's in the next spot. Right, Leanna? Yep. Now, Judy Barnes, our organist and pianist. Look at those two little girls looking down at her as Judy is directing two of her cast members at Kaimima Capers. Those girls couldn't have moved 1 inch with that look Judy's given them. Follow orders, follow the director, right, Judy? That's way too good. That was a very successful evening here at the church. And Judy directed, she wrote, scored, and directed the whole thing by herself. And here we have the choir in full voice, accompanied by Roger Jutinen and his spoons. He's sitting there with his cowboy boots on, playing spoons. The only thing you don't have is a cigar and a cowboy hat. Now here, directed by Stan, is the choir in this last year's Caring and Sharing Festival at the Civic Auditorium here in Rupert. And everybody in full voice. Now here's Jim Rogers. He shares with the multitudes more than bread. I'm telling you, he's a special man. His effort does not go unappreciated. The proceeds go to the scholarship fund. He raises that, he picks it, he boxes it, brings it here, and it's a free will offering. Sometimes he put prices on things that are still under what you'd find in a store, but it's all homegrown. And you can get fresh cut flowers all summer long. He truly is a man to remember. Guess what? Many of you don't remember, but between, I think, Twin Falls and Bliss, towards Mountain Home, but maybe even between Paul out in that area, these signs were on the highway for many, many years. So can you imagine these Californians coming through, going out trying to get some sagebrush in their car? Another one was cattle country. Watch out for bum steers. You wouldn't know a rich steer if you saw one. Then petrified watermelons. Take one home to your mother-in-law. Now see those rocks? Many of you have been down to Hagerman. You see these boulders that were rolled that look into watermelons from the Bonneville flood about 13,000 years ago. It's in the King Hill area, yes. Now, do you like that one? Methodist. Watch out for Mormon crickets. Amen. Isn't that funny? Today it's not politically correct. Let them come. Now, who says that southern Idaho does not have an accent? It says, if you lived here, you'd be home now. You think? And now to attach a little bit more humor to the Methodists. Is Melly Lee and Charles here today? Well, they missed this one, but you can certainly tell them. It's either the family that plays together, stays together, or is it just a Halloween costume? Don't think Methodists don't have a sense of humor. I want to thank you all very much. The food is on out back. Enjoy and have a great day, and thank you very much.